Hello everyone. I let people entering in the Zoom. First of all, I want to welcome you to this new session of the Media Plurality webinar series. So the last one was together with Charles Angelucci, and today we are very glad to have with us Arianna Ornaghi, as well as Professor Angelo Cardani, who accepted very nicely to be a discussant. So Arianna Ornaghi, just in a couple of words, she's an associate professor at the Berlin School of Economics and at the Hertie School. Before that, she did her PhD at MIT, as well as a postdoc at Warwick University. She has a very large number of great publications in economics. She has a publication in the American Economic Review, Journal of Economic History, American Economic Journal, and this is of particular interest for us today. She did great work on media economics. In particular, she has this very nice paper with Nicola Mastrorocco on Who Watched the Watchman, and she's increasingly working on the issues of media consolidation. And this is the work that she's going to present us today with a paper whose title I like Media Consolidation. I think it's a clear cut, simple and super efficient. So thanks for accepting to present this work and discuss it with us today. Also, thanks a lot to Angelo Cardani for accepting to discuss this work. We invited you for a couple of reasons. First of all, for all the research you did in economics. You have been a professor at Bocconi universities for a number of years, but in particular today we decided to invite you as a former president of how do you say that in English, AGCOM, the regulatory agency of the Italian broadcast, and I think this is very important for the kind of discussions we are going to have today. So thanks a lot to the two of you. It's really great to have you here, and as usual, I first want to say thank you to Felipe, who helped me every time to organize this webinar, and who is going to manage the Q&A at the end with me. And I also want to thank Mandy Chan from the CEPR that made this event possible. So the way it is going to work is that first we will have a presentation by Arianna. This would be without interruption, but of course feel free to put any question that you have in the Q&A. Then we will have the discussion by Angelo Cardani, and at the end of the day we will have an open discussion, and everyone will be able to either ask Q&A in the chat if you prefer, but if you want to ask questions directly, you will be more than welcome. So thanks again, and Arianna, now the floor is yours.
Great, let me share my slides and just need to make them full screen. And you should be able to see my slides full screen and everything. Perfect. Great. So thank you so much, Julia, for the really nice introduction. And thanks for inviting me to participate in this Media Plurality webinar that I've been a loyal follower to. I really enjoyed all of the sessions. So today, I'm going to be presenting joint work with Gregory Martin at Stanford GSB, Nicola Mastrorocco at the University of Bologna, and Josh McCrain at the University of Utah. This paper is entitled Media Consolidation, and what we try to do in this paper is understand the effect of conglomerate ownership in the local TV station market in the US. So the key starting point for this project is the recognition that several media industries in the US have been characterized by large increases in ownership concentration since 2010. Let me give you a couple of examples to put this trend into perspective. If we look at local newspapers, what we see is that Gannett, which is the largest conglomerate today, controls about 1/6 of all US dailies, and this is after a 2019 merger with the second largest owner at the time, New Media. In the local TV station market, which is the setting that we're going to be focusing on in our project, the three largest conglomerates own about 40% of all news-producing stations and are currently present in 80% of all US media markets. Now, this trend of increased ownership concentration is by no means restricted to the media and news industry. However, we find it particularly interesting to explore its effect within this industry because of the specific product that is produced in this context. In particular, we can think that news is not just like any other product, but it's quite special and deserves particular attention. And this is particularly because we think that we can think of news as really one of the most fundamental inputs for any well-functioning democratic society. And importantly, this is particularly true at the local level, where traditional media outlets still dominate information production. So to the extent that we think that news is special and news plays this specific role within local democracy, then structural changes in how the news industry functions might really have the potential to be highly consequential for how democracy functions at this level. Now, there are clear reasons that explain the growth of conglomerates within the media industry. I think as economists, it's very intuitive for us to see that conglomerates can really provide an attractive business model for operating local media outlets. First, they are in a better position to negotiate retransmission fees, both with networks and with, for example, cable companies or satellite TV. And second, they're really likely to present economies of scale, both on the operational and content production side, and also economies of scope, for example, in advertising sales. At the same time, however, the reason why we might be particularly interested in conglomerates in this industry is that conglomerate ownership is very likely to impact what we care about in this setting, that is content. And in particular here in this paper, we're going to be thinking about coverage of local events as kind of our main dimension of content that we're going to be studying. And so, for example, if we think of economies of scale, well, they might impact content because if they realize in content production, they're not going to be neutral with respect to type of content being produced. And in particular, we can think that economies of scale are really going to be present for content that is more of a national scope that can be packaged and retransmitted across different media outlets that are owned by the same conglomerate. And as a result, just the presence of economies of scale in content production might change the relative cost of national versus local coverage, thereby leading to a nationalization of news content that, that might change, that might have important downstream consequences in, for example, political knowledge or more generally for politics. However, it is also important to keep in mind that the direction of the change in local content is a priori not straightforward. And indeed, there are other forces that might actually lead conglomerates to change content in a different direction. And one of these, for example, is the idea that conglomerates increase market power on the advertising side could increase returns to the differentiation and actually could increase investment in news quality. And so kind of thinking about these different forces that might be at play really suggests that, first of all, the effect of local coverage is not straightforward a priori, but also that it's going to be important to study both content and advertising choices jointly if you're really interested in understanding the full effect of these conglomerates. So what do we do in this paper? Well, we try to do just that. We start by looking at the effect of conglomerate acquisition in this specific local TV station market in the US. We are going to start by looking at stations' content and advertising choices. But because we are political economists, and so ultimately we are also interested in studying the downstream impact of these potential changes, we're also going to be looking at effects on viewership and individuals' political knowledge. Now, to put what we do in perspective, it's important to have an idea of what has been, what we know so far about local TV conglomerates. And indeed, there's been recent work that has started to study conglomerates in this market but has mainly focused on the effect of a very specific group, Sinclair. And Sinclair is specific because it is an explicitly political broadcast group, and indeed it has more of a right-leaning political stance. And what research has shown is that Sinclair acquisition decreased local coverage and substituted with national coverage instead. It increases conservative slant, but to a smaller extent. And also it has political consequences, in particular in national election, with a shift towards more higher Republican vote share. Now, we, of course, find this work very interesting. We have contributed to it directly, but at the same time, we think that there are also still many open questions on how conglomerate ownership actually impacts these stations more broadly. So first of all, you may think that Sinclair is special because of these potential additional or market objectives that might be relevant for the group. And this opens the question of whether the effects that have been documented thus far are Sinclair-specific effects or more general conglomerate owner effects. At the same time, the literature has looked at content, has looked at some downstream outcomes, but hasn't really considered what happens to advertising choices that I've just made an argument that are also important to look at, especially if content and advertising choices in this type of kind of media markets that we can think of as two-sided platform might be related. And also kind of to link changes on from the media side onto kind of changes in politics is also important to have a sense of viewers. What are viewers doing? Are viewers changing their content consumption? And this is something that we still don't know a lot about. And these are the questions that we're going to try and address in this paper, and we think that these are particularly important questions that we need to study, that we need to understand if we want to think more broadly about how ownership concentration in media industries should be regulated. So I'm going to just give you a one-slide summary of what we do in the paper before I go and tell you in detail about what we do. The setting that we study is the local TV station market in the US, and we study from 2010 to 2020. We focus on three largest groups: Sinclair, Nexstar, and Gray. And we're going to be thinking about Sinclair as more of a politically motivated owner, potentially, and we're going to be thinking about Nexstar and Gray as standard profit maximizers. Our empirical strategy is a differences in differences design that exploits the staggered timing of the acquisitions of these three conglomerates. We are going to combine this with a triple difference design in which we are only going to exploit variation across stations that operate in the same market. So what do we find? Well, we are going to find that conglomerates have large impacts on local coverage, but these impacts are going to be very heterogeneous. What we see is that when Sinclair acquires a station, they decrease local coverage, but when Nexstar does, they actually increase it almost by the same amount. Instead, when we look at advertising, we see that effects are much less heterogeneous, and indeed, both Sinclair and Nexstar increase ads duration, and this results in increased advertising revenue at the station level. Now, what is also very interesting is that even though we document quite sizable changes in content and quite sizable changes in advertising, viewers really do not appear to respond. We find that viewership of this station is quite flat around acquisitions. What is also perhaps surprising is that we do not see effects on political knowledge. And I'm going to spend a few minutes at the end discussing why we think this is the case and why we think this is very much linked to the specific market structure of the industry we are studying. So very briefly, we, of course, speak to a literature in the economics of media that thinks about the supply side change, the effect of supply side changes on content and political outcomes. We are particularly related to work that studies the role of politically motivated owners. And also, although we take a very different perspective, we are, of course, in very close conversation to work in industrial organization that takes a more structural approach. Now, relative to existing works, what we do is that we really highlight that the cost structure of conglomerates might impact content more generally than in the specific case of politically motivated owners. And this allows us to really explore the effect of whether there are heterogeneous effects of conglomerates that seemingly might have different objective functions. We really do an extensive data collection for this project that allows us to track the effect of conglomerate ownership through the causal change, or at least we try to do that. And finally, we are really going to be contributing to the discourse of consequences of ownership concentration and how to regulate it in media markets by really highlighting the importance of the specificity of different media industries. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about the setting that we study. Local TV stations in the US transmit a mix of local and national content. This national content they get from networks that are affiliated to, but importantly for us, they are always going to be producing their newscasts locally. Each station operates and has a license for a specific media market, which I'm going to call throughout also a DMA. And DMAs are areas in which all households are going to have access to the same stations, and they're going to be well delineated. There are about 205 DMAs in the continental US, and there are 2 to 4 news-producing stations in each DMA. Now, there are some restrictions that the FCC imposes in this market on the amount of overall ownership concentration. First of all, there are restrictions that operate at the DMA level. And in particular, the FCC restricts a single owner to control 1 out of the 4 largest stations in the market. And in addition to this, there are also restrictions at the more aggregate level, at the national level. For example, a single owner can operate in markets that cover now a maximum of 39% of the US population. So, as I said before, I really motivated this project by saying that conglomerate ownership has really increased over the period that we study. And indeed, this is what we are showing with this picture with some hard numbers. At the beginning of the period in 2010, we have less than 100 stations that are owned by one of these 3 largest conglomerates. And by the end of the period, this number has almost tripled to more than 300 stations under conglomerate ownership. This increase in conglomerate ownership is driven by different ways of acquisitions of different groups. In yellow here, we see Sinclair. They start pretty much at the same level as Nexstar Gray in 2010. They start doing their acquisition a little bit earlier, and they have a lot of movement between 2013 and 2015. At a certain point, they reach the maximum number of DMAs in which they can operate in, and the number of their stations plateaus. Nexstar similarly starts at the same level, moves kind of around the same period. They do the first acquisition in 2013, 2015, but then they really become a large conglomerate when they acquire MediaGen in 2017. Gray also starts at the same level, but starts their acquisition a little bit later. And finally, they become a large group in 2019 when they acquire Raycom. Now, unsurprisingly, this increase in ownership concentration at the station level is also reflected at the media market level. What I'm showing you in the graph on the left is the share of media markets that have at least 1 station owned by a conglomerate. And as you can see, start of the period, this share is about 40%, and it grows to 80% by the end of the period. Multiple conglomerates can also operate in the same market. And so at the beginning of the period, within a market, on average, about 15% of stations are owned by a conglomerate, and this number goes up to 40% by the end of the period. Now, as I said before, because of restrictions in ownership at the local level, if a group decides to expand, they're going to have to do so by entering different markets. And so, unsurprisingly, we see that acquisitions by conglomerates have really taken place all across the US. What I'm showing in this map what I'm showing in this figure is a map of media markets in the US, where darker colors correspond to a longer time under conglomerate ownership. And as you can see, acquisitions have really taken place all across the US, although the largest media markets have not been directly involved in this trend. Now, if we were to look at maps for the specific groups, we would see that they do start perhaps on different, in slightly different areas, but over time they really all have this national dimension and they really expand across all different regions in the US, which is what makes them what differentiates them actually from other groups that we might also think operate in more markets, but tend to be more regional. Okay, so for this project, we combine several different data sources. First, we collected acquisition dates of these groups from the yearly company reports of these companies to their shareholder. Likely, they are all publicly listed, so we have a lot of information on their activity that we can recover from these reports or kind of the SEC 10K forms. To document how conglomerates impact content, we use transcripts of local TV newscasts that we got from TVIs from 2013 to 2019. And what this gives us are closed caption text of what we think is close to the universe of all newscasts that were transmitted by local TV stations over the time period that we study. The way in which we use this transcript is to construct a measure of local coverage, which is simply going to be the number of mentions of places and different politicians normalized by number of shows in our dataset in a given month. And we're going to do this by using simple dictionary methods. We also have advertising and viewership from Nielsen's Intel database from 2010 to 2019. This database includes duration, spending, and impressions at the ad level for all ads that were transmitted on local TV stations over this time period. We are going to take duration and spending and aggregate it at the monthly level, and then we're going to normalize it per half hour of local news. And in addition to this, we're also going to use impressions of advertising as a proxy for programs viewership. And there we're just going to take the average for local news programs. And again, our datasets are always going to be at the month by station level. Finally, to look at political knowledge, we are going to use survey data from CCS, again from 2010 to 2020. So our starting point for identification is, as you probably can imagine by what I've shown you so far, is a staggered diff-in-diff design where identification is going to rely on the timing of acquisition being exogenous to station and market level trends. Now, of course, we perfectly realize that this is a great starting point, but it also requires us to make a relatively strong identification assumption for the setting that we are considering. And in particular, there are two types of concerns that we might have as far as identification is concerned. We are going to be worried that conglomerates might be entering markets where revenues are expected to be growing, or also within market, they might be selectively targeting the stations they acquire, and you can have different explanation for whether they are targeting stations that are over or underperforming. We do three main things to address these concerns. The first thing that we do addresses the concern of endogenous entry at the market level. And what we can do to address this concern is that we can estimate companion triple differences specification that only exploit within DMA variation, which effectively addresses the possibility of DMA level trends or contemporaneous shocks. So anything that happens at the DMA level, we are going to be able to account for. Now, in addition to this, we also check for pre-trends. We try to provide supportive evidence for whether the effect that we see start before the acquisition by estimating given study specifications. And we're going to use both standard two-way fixed effect specification and estimators that are robust to concerns of heterogeneous effects. And finally, we are also going to build in some more flexibility within our specification by allowing for non-parametric trends based on stations' baseline characteristics. And so effectively, identification then is going to rely on the timing of the acquisition of specific stations within a media market being exogenous, conditional on the station's baseline characteristics, which we think is it's a little bit less of a difficult assumption to make in this setting. Okay, this is our baseline specification that we estimate. Our outcome is at the station, and our outcomes are going to be at the station and month level. We are going to regress it on 3 different dummies, one per group, which are going to be equal to 1 after conglomerate G acquires the station. As I said before, we are going to include baseline station characteristics interacted with month fixed effects. And the station characteristics that we include are S duration, standing, and news rating in 2010 of the station. We have station fixed effects that control for fixed characteristics of the station, and also we have month fixed effects that control for shocks that affect all stations at different points in time. And we cluster standard errors at the media market level. Now, as I said, we also have a triple diff specification, which is our preferred specification for the station level analysis, where the only difference is that we include now DMA by month fixed effects that really ensure we are only using variation of stations that operate within the same market. Okay, so the first question that we ask is whether conglomerates impact content. And in particular, we're interested in looking at coverage of local events. What I'm showing you here is our main estimates for the 3 different groups. And I'm going to be showing you throughout the talk, in general, both our diff in diff specification, column 1 and 2, and triple diff, column 3 and 4, with and without the station controls. Let's start by looking at our baseline diff in diff and at what happens when Sinclair acquires a station. When Sinclair acquires a station, they decrease the number of mention of local places per show by about 1.5. And this is relative to a baseline mean of about 15. So this is about a 10% decrease relative to the baseline mean. If we include the station level controls, things are very robust. The coefficient almost doesn't change. And similarly, we also find that this effect is not driven by media market level trends, because once we include the DMA by month fixed effects, again, the result is very robust. Now, what is also very striking in this table is that when Nextara acquires a station, we also estimate a significant change in coverage of local events, but the change goes into the opposite direction. After Nextara acquires a station, mentions normalized by number of show increase by about 0.8 points. This is 5% of the baseline mean. And again, the result is fairly robust across specification. It actually becomes larger once we move to our triple diff specification. Now, these effects are not driven by pre-existing trends. What I'm showing you here are the estimates for our event study specification, separately for our diff in diff in the panel on the left and our triple diff in the panel on the right. And as you can see, there's nothing much going on before the acquisition actually happens. Immediately after Sinclair acquires a station, they start decreasing coverage of local events, and the effect becomes larger over time. Now, similarly, when Nextara acquires a station, nothing much happens before, and then within a year since the acquisition, they increase their coverage of local events, and this effect then plateaus. If we move to the triple diff specification, what we see is that the effect for Nextara is very robust, is very similar. For Sinclair, it looks like it might take a little bit longer for the effect to realize, but again, the effect becomes larger and significant as we move on from the time since the acquisition. Okay. Now, what I've shown you so far is a measure of local coverage that may potentially pick up any sort of coverage of local events. So we could be picking up maybe local politics, that ultimately is what we care the most about, but we could also be picking up some changes in coverage of local crime or anything else that's very local. So what we do in this table is we look at local coverage of local politics specifically. And in order to do this, we look at mentions of different types of local politicians. We are looking at mentions of mayors, mentions of state legislatures, and mentions of members of Congress. And throughout, we see that also when we zoom in and we focus on local politics specifically, after Sinclair acquires a station, they decrease coverage of local politics, of these local politicians, whereas we see exactly the opposite when Nexstar acquires a station. And what is interesting is that if we normalize these effects relative to the baseline mean, we see now that the effects on local politics can potentially be even larger. Remember, with mentions, we had effects that were 5 to 10% of the baseline mean. Here, we actually have much larger effects, even to 30 to 40% of the baseline mean. Okay, so just to wrap up what we find on content, we find large effects on local coverage that is, however, highly heterogeneous by group. And this is interesting because it starts suggesting that cost-cutting might not be necessarily the dominant response, and instead some conglomerates might actually find it optimal to differentiate, as kind of some of the theory in IO would also suggest. Okay, so I've shown you what we find on content. The second thing that we do is that we look at the effect of conglomerates on advertising. And what is interesting here is that we also find large effects on advertising, but they're much less heterogeneous across groups. What I'm showing here is the effect on log duration of advertising per half hour of local use in a month in columns 1 to 4. And then we also look at revenues similarly normalized in columns 5 to 8. And what we see is that after Sinclair acquires the station, they increase the duration of advertising per half hour of local news of 4.5 to 6.5%. And similarly, Nexstar also increases the duration of advertising in kind of, and effects are kind of similar magnitude, 3 to 5%. We also see that, at least as far as Nexstar is concerned, we see similar effects, if not even larger, on the revenues that these stations get from advertising. And with Sinclair, we only see the increase of advertising once we zoom in the triple diff specification. Now, in terms of magnitude, just to set ideas, these are large effects. The increase in duration, like 5% increase in duration of advertising corresponds to about 25 seconds more ads per half hour of local news. And this is almost a full ad. And in terms of revenues, a 5% increase in revenue is about $400 per half hour of local news. So they are kind of substantial increases in terms of economic magnitudes. Again, these effects don't seem to be driven by pre-existing trends. There's not a lot going on before the acquisition in either our triple diff or diff in diff specification. And immediately after the acquisition, there is this increase in advertising duration that then plateaus and is stable over time. And if we look at even studies for revenues, they're going to look fairly comparable. Now, what is interesting is that because we are now looking at conglomerates that operate across different markets, we might also be interested in understanding whether the firms that are buying advertising are also changing. And here we see kind of some different strategies from Nexstar and Sinclair. Nexstar seems to increase the duration of advertising both for single market and multi-market advertisers. These are going to be advertisers that operate only that buy ads only within a market or across multiple markets. So they increase across the board, the share doesn't change, and they get increased revenues from both. Whereas when we look at Sinclair, it seems that they're shifting the identity of the firms they're selling advertising to. They are increasing sales to multi-market advertising and decreasing sales to single market advertising. Now, because prices are also slightly different across these two types, in general, at least in the triple diff specification, we end up seeing increased revenues for Sinclair as well. But there is a shift in where these revenues are coming from. We might also be interested in cost per miles, which is the standard measure of pricing in the advertising literature. These are advertising revenue normalized by 1,000 impressions. And again, we see that Nexstar is not changing cost per mile all that much. It does seem that Sinclair is moving a little bit along the demand curve of the multi-market advertising with a little bit of a decreased cost per mile, which is, however, fairly small in magnitude. So to sum up the results on advertising, what we find is that both Sinclair and Nexstar increase the station's advertising revenues, but they seem to do so slightly differently. Sinclair is selling more to multi-market advertisers at a slightly lower price. Nexstar seems to be selling slightly more to single market advertiser, but is not at the point of affecting the share and doesn't change the price. And what we see when we look at non-news programs, we see that Sinclair, but not Nexstar, increases advertising more across the board. And kind of on the revenue side, but this is just anecdotally, it's not something that we are going to be able to speak to in the data. We kind of, again, sustain this idea that from the business perspective, these conglomerates are effectively successful at operating the stations, because we also know we have these increasing advertising revenues, but we also know anecdotally that they seem to be effective at negotiating better fees with cable and satellite companies, which are an important source of revenues for these TV stations. Okay, so I've shown you large changes in content, large changes in advertising. Do viewers respond? The answer is pretty much no. When we look at two proxies for viewership. We look at ratings, which are the share of TV households that are watching a given program at a given time. And we also look at log advertising impressions that are proxy for viewership. And definitely, if we look at Sinclair, we don't see much going on. And in particular for Sinclair, we can basically rule out declines in rating of about 2 to 3% of the baseline mean. Now, when we look at Sinclair, the picture is not as clear, it's a little bit more muddled. We sometimes see positive effect on viewership, depending on kind of the specification and how we are proxying for viewership, but in general, these results are not very robust. And for gray, we have some effects, but they're clearly driven by kind of station-specific controls, station-specific trends. So in general, we are not spending a lot of time thinking about gray because we have less power to look at what is going on to them. And in general, they seem to have less interesting dynamics for us. So you might think that maybe what is going on is that there may be some short-term effects or, that are different than long-term effects. But in general, if we estimate event study graphs, we see that both for Sinclair and Nexstar, things are pretty flat, either in the short or long run. And also there's not a lot of evidence of pre-trends. So definitely it seems that there's nothing much that is going on the viewership side. And so the way in which we think about this result is twofold. So on the one hand, you might think that perhaps what this is signaling is that the decision of whether to watch TV or not is not really driven by local news. We can think of it as a bundled product. It comes with entertainment. It also comes with local news. And so maybe primarily the decision to watch local TV is not driven by news. That's a possibility. But you could also think that what explains this result is that there is substantial inertia in viewers' choices, which is basically kind of showing that, independently, at least with the level of changes that we are seeing, independently of kind of how content is changing, viewers keep with their habit and they keep watching the same TV station. Now, what is interesting here, just to kind of put things a little bit more in perspective, is that if anything, if we see some changes in viewership, they tend to come for Nexstar, and in particular, they tend to come for the core audience of local news, so people above 55, which perhaps is going into a direction. Maybe there is something going on, but also definitely there are not large changes. And viewership of non-news programs, perhaps consistent with the first explanation, also doesn't change. And so the way in which we think about this finding is that, well, it really does seem that consumers' response it doesn't seem to be a limiting factor for conglomerate owners' content or advertising choices. And this is a little bit in contrast with evidence in other settings that, for example, looked at individuals' response to propaganda or biased news. It's perhaps kind of these changes are not large enough. Perhaps with changes in larger magnitude, we could still see some effects, but at least for what we are seeing here, they're not these larger effects. And what is also interesting is that perhaps as a consequence of this, if we look at dynamics within market, we don't see much. So there's really limited response on part of other local stations that operate in the same market and across groups. And so overall, what this suggests is that it looks like we are in a setting where there might be potentially high levels of media power a la 2018. And so this really motivates us to then kind of take the next step, the final step for this project, and look at political knowledge. And we're thinking about the way in which we're thinking about political knowledge in this setting is as really kind of a key building block for any other potential political effects that we might have of these changes at the local level. Now, to understand kind of this downstream effect, what we're using now is survey data on individuals' knowledge of their members of Congress that we have from CCS from 2010 to 2020. Now, a key restriction that we face when using this data is that, unfortunately, it doesn't carry information on individual-specific viewing habits. So we don't know which stations they're watching, if at all. And so in this specification, we are in this part of the analysis, we are going to be looking at treatment that are assigned at the DMA level. And in particular, we're going to be estimating intent to treat effects. This is our baseline specification at the respondent level. Look, it's going to look the same as before. And we're going to have, however, some individual level controls. And the treatment is at the media market level. These are the two big differences here. So what do we see when we look at the effect on political knowledge? Not a lot, again. So what we see is that after Sinclair acquires the station, the kind of respondents are not better able to recall the name of their representatives, they're not better able to evaluate them, or they're not better able to express a preference of election. Now, these are not super precisely estimated outcomes, but we can reject, in the case of Sinclair, a decrease in knowledge of 15% of the baseline mean. And for Nexstar, we can reject effects of increases in knowledge in the range of about 5 to 15%, again, of the baseline mean. So the way in which we are thinking about this result is that we don't see large changes, at least in political knowledge, which is kind of a precondition for then having downstream outcomes in how these elections work. Now, you might think that, well, what is going on here is that local TV stations are just not a relevant source of information for members of Congress. However, we don't think that this is what explains our result, because we can show, using the standard idea of congruence that was initially developed by Snyder and Stromberg for local newspapers, and we just replicate here, we find that congressional representatives that receive higher coverage from local TV for exogenous reasons related to the size, kind of to the shape of the market, also have higher levels of political knowledge, and kind of these effects have kind of relevant, interesting magnitudes. So what we think is going on here is actually that there is something very specific that relates to the structure of the local TV markets. Remember, I told you when I was showing you the background that in general there are 3 to 4 news-producing local TV stations in each DMA. And this makes local TV stations quite different than newspapers that tend to be at the local level, either duopolies or monopolies. And so what this means is that the specific market structure or local TV effectively retains relatively high level of competition at the local level, even if we have significant ownership concentration at the national level. And effectively then, if we have these multiple stations operating in the same market, even large changes in content in the content of one station might have maybe large effects in the knowledge of the people that are watching the station, but don't quite translate to an intent to treat effect on the average individual in the DMA. Okay, so to conclude, because I'm almost out of time, in this paper, we document that conglomerates have large impacts on local coverage, but they don't always go in the same direction. Conglomerates do tend to increase station revenues through higher ads duration in particular, and viewers don't respond. But at the same time, we do not see large effects of political knowledge. And so I think that our results are quite interesting for how we can think of regulation of the media industry. In particular, what we want to underline, what we try to underline also in our conclusions, but we don't think that what our results shows is that, yes, like we shouldn't care about regulating ownership concentration in media industries at all. Instead, what we think our results highlight is that it's very important then for regulation to consider the specific market structure of the different media industries. And in particular, it does appear that these provisions that preserve within market competition appear to be particularly important for kind of preserving a healthy media environment relative to kind of in a setting where we might end up with high and growing national level ownership concentration. Okay, this is all I have to show you for today. Thank you so much for the attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Cardani's comment and the Q&A as well.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Arianna, for a great presentation. Professor Cardani, I don't know whether you have some slides to share or just want to...
No.
Perfect. So the floor is yours.
Am I on? Okay. So the paper by Martin, Mastrorocco, McCrain, and Ornaghi that we heard presented by Arianna is very interesting. It's truly very interesting for a series of reasons. First of all, I think that it's an example of extremely careful analysis, detailed with extreme care in the significance of the empirical model. So a work very, very well done, whose results do not match the effort that is clearly being poured into this enterprise. But the results are good, but are just difficult, extremely difficult to interpret. And the first kind of conclusion that one might get, that I would get, I was asked at the very beginning to act as a discussant coming from the word of the regulation, of the authorities for regulation. Well, as a former regulator, even though once a regulator, always a regulator, I believe that this would be paradise. We have no significant effect or say determined effect on the issue of pluralism, the issue of effect on viewers, on ownership change, all the paraphernalia that a regulator would care of in deciding a policy. But on the other hand, the results that Ornaghi and company get are very robust, are very serious. So we cannot dismiss them as something not to be cared of. They are very robust and even though inconclusive. So one might ask whether the policy directions that are subsiding to the regulators in most countries are reasonable, are acceptable, are focused or not. Now, I would categorize, even though it's a very rough categorization, and therefore not not detailed and not precise, that the main divide between the US and, say, the EU, and when I say EU, I intend all the policies in the member states that are framed by the EU legislation. The main divide is that the US approach is more, how shall I put it, geared to concrete results. The US is more focused on consumer welfare, on economic efficiency, and pluralism, which on the other hand is the main focus in the EU. In the US is more seen as a appreciable and positive consequence of competitive dynamics, which are the main tools of the regulator. Say the EU approach is more geared to a subtle equilibrium between economic competition on the one side and pluralism on the other. Even though this is traced by separate paths for each of the two. In fact, one could easily claim that the antitrust authorities in Europe deal with competition, period, and the regulator or regulating authorities deal with information pluralism. Of course, the governance is different. The EU has at the helm a traditional model of multi-level structured competition and cooperation, where the each media regulator monitors pluralism and then contributes to the evaluation of media concentration and cooperates at the level of the EU regulation board, the so-called ERGA, and the also now increasingly cooperates with advice, increasingly mandatory for the statements and the decision of the Commission. Another interesting, very interesting element that should be taken into account in looking at the different approaches is the fact that there is one common, very common approach, that is the increasing role taken up by constitutional courts, both in the constitutional courts of single member states and the European Court, and interestingly, not just the Court of Justice, but also the European Court of Human Rights. In the US, of course, the Supreme Court. And this comes from the fact that at the constitutional level, are addressed increasingly issues concerning information, the increasing role of digital platforms, and therefore all the issues that slowly take up the problem of pluralism. Now, sorry, I have a drop in my notes. The issue of the limits of concentration, or say ownership to concentrations and acquisitions. Now, that is something that I had to deal with in AGCOM at the level of the authority, and I think it's relevant because at the end of the day, it is the main issue that is somewhat dealt with in the paper. That is the existing framework in Italy is depicts clearly the difficulty of choices. That is, on the one hand, we have a stream of legislation that comes from the traditional legislation for newspapers, being a very important politically, but also from the reasonable democratic approach to political life. This stream has been surviving, while on the side there is another stream of legislation that comes from the increasingly room acquired by call it digital publications or digital platforms. Now, we have a clear example of this, say, separation when looking at one relatively important and famous judgment of the Italian court concerning the participation of Vivendi to the capital of Mediaset. Now, this is a very peculiar case because it's based on, say, limits to participation and therefore limits to concentration, if you wish, originating from the printed press legislation, but ending up in a much wider stream that defines the measure of the problem that we're studying, not really market. It's a sort of relatively vague definition, which is called integrated system of communication. Now, what I think is very interesting when we compare on the one side the traditional, relatively simple and linear approach to the printed press, and on the other hand, the integrated system of communication, is the fact that there is, of course, a very acceptable reason in talking about an integrated system. Why? Well, because the information world has changed, and it's now something, a bubbling cauldron in which you have systems and means of participating to the market that enter the system, leave the system, are extremely dynamic. Being extremely dynamic, it's very difficult to understand where they are going and whether we're measuring correctly the phenomenon. So, as a result, you can easily interpret the integrated system of communication like a statistical measurement of the fusion, of the mixing up of all different strands, which we use to analyze in a totally separate way, that is printed press, radio, TV, linear TV, VOD, AVOD, I mean, all the different strands. Now, if you look at SIC, the numbers that the last number published are the numbers relative to 2022, and we have that the 10 largest actors in the SIC cover 66% plus something of the ownership. The largest four, sort of a CR4 index, are 45.9, 46%. Now, these are numbers that somewhat do not cry wolf. Our concentration characteristics relatively reasonable and acceptable for a country like Italy. I would stop here and perhaps touch another couple of points in the discussion. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a great discussion. Before turning to the Q&A, perhaps Arianna, you want to follow up on the discussion?
Yes, so thank you so much, Angelo, for the comments. They were, super interesting, especially I think for for me, like I've done a lot of my work in the US, but of course I'm also Italian, so I also live in the EU. So kind of having this sense of like the different approaches to these questions across the different systems are super helpful to know, and super interesting to I think it's super interesting to think about. And I think this point of how a lot of what we have thought about really comes from like, newspapers that might function in a specific way, and to the extent to which what we know for newspapers actually translates to other type of media, like, I mean, starting from even other traditional media and like, to the extreme also on how it translates to digital platforms is, I find, super fascinating. It was great to hear. I think kind of good food for thoughts also for us to think a little bit more about what we can more broadly say from our findings, which is something that we're still spending time thinking about.
Well, if I may, thank you for this comment. Also because there is a question that I didn't dare to ask during a formal, quote unquote, discussion. But the question is, where do you go from your results? Your results are strong and in a sense clear, but they do not help in drafting a direction.
No, and this is an excellent point, and I think this is what is one of the most challenging, one of the more challenging takeaways, I think, from this particular research that we have done, is that in a way it's also like the findings that we have are very different than what we were expecting. We're expecting much stronger kind of conglomerate effects. We really came into this thinking like economies of scale are going to dominate. And that we also came from the Sinclair experience, having worked on Sinclair, and so we kind of thought, okay, I mean, it's interesting to look at the other groups, but we were expecting very similar effects. And so looking at the heterogeneity is challenging, because at the same, in a way, it's like somewhat reassuring to some extent, but at the same time, it's also then kind of opens the question of, if these groups behave so differently, then also how do you ex ante regulate them? And unfortunately, that's not something we have, there's not something we have a great answer for. We have tried to like really think about, is there something special about these groups? And potentially you have this non-market objective of Sinclair that might be part of that. But other than that, it's also like a little bit, there could be other things that are going on. And that's, we're trying to think about, but we don't have a clear direction on how to do so. So I think kind of then practically for us, it's really thinking, okay, maybe because we have these two levels of restrictions of increased ownership, one at the national level, one at the local level, then we're thinking, well, maybe if the market effectively for this station is the relevant one, perhaps is indeed the local one, then kind of those ones are more are particularly important to preserve, even though there could also be arguments that maybe also the efficiency arguments also are very strong potentially at the local level, but it seems that to keep this local level competition, if we're interested in the local democracy aspect, then this local restriction might be particularly relevant, rather than the national ones are also potentially relevant, because you also imagine tipping points down the line, but kind of highlighting this local aspect was perhaps one of the things that we felt more comfortable doing when thinking about policy implication, I would say.
Thank you.
Okay. And so I will just take advantage of having the lead to ask the first question following the discussion, and before turning to the Q&A that we have. So, okay, we talk a lot about like the supply aspect in a sense, and the impact of concentration, which might be different of what you expected. But one of the findings that I like and surprised me a little bit is the fact that you find that viewers, they do not respond to changes in content. While if we looked at the existing literature, I'm thinking in particular on the work by, I think, Brian Knight, Ruben Durante, others, on Italian TV under Berlusconi, we see that viewers, it tends to adjust to bias. So at the beginning, I was just thinking perhaps this is due to the fact that this is kind of short term, so people are not aware. But at the end of the day, you don't have like 1 point. You have like data for like a pretty fair number of years. So yeah, I just want to get your point of how do you rationalize this finding in particular compared to what we know from the existing literature.
No, for sure. And definitely, I think in the short run, it's more understandable because these acquisitions in particular tend to be very opaque from the point of view of the viewer, because effectively the news anchor is the same, the channel is the same, the schedule of the program is the same. And so it's, I think, kind of from that perspective, is a little bit different than entry of a new channel, which might explain some of that effect. It is surprising, though, that after 2 or 3, like, this makes sense within a year, within a few months, but after 2 years or 3 years, if there's really a drop in local content by 25%, it's like, how do you not? I mean, of course, you're going to realize it, and like it's surprising that one doesn't respond to that. So this is kind of, we have a couple of potential rationalization for that. I don't know that we have kind of a bulletproof answer. So of course, like it could be that, I mean, with TV stations, they are bundled. The content of the TV station is very much bundled with other things. And so it's a question of, do people kind of decide which newscasts to look at these local newscasts specifically because of the content of the local newscast, or is it more like they decide to, that they are kind of consumer of a given station because they like the ABC sitcoms, and then kind of they always end up consuming the same stations? And we did some additional work with data, with additional data where we try to understand whether there's a lot of switching of people across different stations or not. Greg has this really nice data with cable over the with cable boxes, basically, where we know exactly what people are watching at different times. We only have it for a few months and for a very small sample, so there's not much we can do with that. But interestingly, there we basically, it does seem that people are always watching the same station. It's very hard that they switch, and so maybe there is like kind of this habit or preferred preferred station element that goes into that, and maybe that has a bigger effect. So we probably think it's a combination perhaps of these like inertia and also kind of the bundling side that maybe creates even more loyalty to a specific brand of TV, but to a specific channel than in other contexts. That's a little bit the ways we're thinking. And it's also in line, I think, Josh has some interesting work that's basically trying to see whether viewership of local news goes up before elections, and he finds that there's not a lot. The viewership is quite flat, so it's perhaps the other factors that are explaining local TV viewership rather than kind of this search for local news.
All right, thank you, Arianna. So let's maybe turn to the Q&A questions now. Unless you have other questions, Julia? No, okay.
So I have plenty, but then...
Okay, so we have a question in the Q&A from Roberta Carlini. She works at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at EUI, and she has a question on the findings of Arianna on policy solutions. The first one, impact on content is heterogeneous. If I correctly understood, your findings detect the impact on coverage of local news politicians, not the impact on diversity pluralism. Is this correct? And the second question is on Article 22 of the EMFA calls for an assessment of the impact of media market concentrations on pluralism and editorial independence. Do you think that this regulation can effectively address the risks related to media market concentration?
Great. So thank you, Felipe, for reading the question, and also thanks, Roberto, for the very detailed question. And I think this is something that is important to have in mind when thinking about our results. So definitely when we're thinking about content, we are very specifically only looking at this measure of how much local events you cover. We think that to the extent that we're interested in a direction of effects on local, thinking about the local aspects, effect on local on local elections. This is probably the first order approximation that we're comfortable in doing, but it definitely doesn't address the broader question of what happens to pluralism. And in particular, if we're thinking about these conglomerates, there is some evidence that Sinclair does introduce does shift content more towards conservative kind of narratives, conservative slant, especially in their national news coverage, and we don't know about the other groups. What is interesting is that, I mean, we've tried, so when we haven't focused on that for this project, we have implemented the standard slant measure of Ganskow, Shapiro, Taddy. And I think there we don't find much, but we think that there might be some data-related reasons for why we don't find much. They talk a lot about local things, not so much about national news. And so it ends up being the case that we don't have a lot of variation in slant across TV stations, which makes us think that probably we need to be a little bit more subtle and look at specific narratives. And indeed, in Nicola and I's paper, we did find evidence that specific narratives related to crime were introduced with Sinclair, but we haven't tackled it directly in this paper. And so I think kind of that's something that is also very important to do for sure, especially if we're thinking more broadly. Then from that perspective, maybe at the national level, then increasing overall concentration could have these other consequences as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, one question that I also have for you, Arianna, is also about what about the interaction of social media with your outcome on local news coverage? Because also there's also the literature that says that like social media per se leads to this sort of nationalization of interest to politics. So I mean, do you find any sort of variance with the timings that you're analyzing or?
Now, this is an excellent point and something that we should probably do more to think about, maybe some variation of intensity of social media presence. I think what is interesting is once we start thinking about these local media outlets, especially in the markets where a lot of these acquisitions are taking place, which tend to be the more kind of medium, smaller size rather than the very big one. What is interesting and what is important to keep in mind is also on social media or like on kind of the digital side of things, a lot of the content being disseminated about what is going on at the local level does come from the local media outlets directly. Like I think in larger media markets, that's not the case. You have a lot of online only publication, but it does seem that they do have a role also on the digital side. And that's something that I think it's interesting, and hopefully we should do maybe more thinking about this idea. I think of the interplay between the two at the local level, particularly. I think it's an open area that would be interesting to do more about. But it does seem that they might be going together to some extent.
Okay, very nice. So I don't know if maybe Angelo, do you want maybe to add anything or Julia, do you?
Someone else wants to add a question? Well, I guess I will have a last one and then we might conclude, which is, but this is linked also to what Professor Cardani asked. Do you think that at some point you will be able to analyze this concentration like across media support? What I mean is, like, we know that a lot of these like conglomerates now they're on TV, but also sometimes radio, and they might own newspapers. This has been regulated for a while in the US, and this is not really longer the case. And with Trump, it might become ever worse because from what I understood, he wants just to like end the FCC. So this would be. So, like, yeah, do you see that as a feasible? So this is not like about what you do because I think it would be too much for this paper. But do you see that as something feasible in terms of research project, like to look across platforms, let's say, at this effect of concentration, or do you think that it won't work?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge probably would be like practical in terms of data availability. I think that'd be super interesting, but I guess like to properly answer that question, it would require some really nice kind of survey data that tracks people a little bit more in their consumption. And I think for the US, I haven't seen a lot that goes into that direction. There's some interesting survey data that's more marketing based, like GfK, that does a little bit in that direction, but it's kind of like, it's not representative. It's like a specific subsample, and it's a little bit unclear what effectively can be done with that. But I really think that's kind of probably the biggest constraint. It would require a lot more on that side, because even kind of I'm thinking of there have been larger efforts of putting together data on media consumption or like a variety of outcomes, but I think probably it would have to be more like a large scale survey sort of effort, which unfortunately we don't have. Even on CCES, I mean, they don't even ask every year whether people are watching local TV, for example, which is a bit of a pity. So hopefully more. I think France has a lot better data from that perspective with like survey, not really. I guess it's always the thing is like when you're not working on a specific setting, you look at vague
At least I
papers,
am
you're
not
like,
happy
oh,
with
it's
the
okay.
data that we have.
Okay. Yeah.
So, Professor Cardani, perhaps you want to add something or?
Just a simple comment. That is, I see the problem in, I say in Europe because I'm more familiar with the legislation, but the substance is similar everywhere. That is, we have markets that are not easily defined for a series of reasons. Last but not least, the fact that daily there are changes and subsectors that enter or leave the arena for competition. Now, the choice is to operate with this large definition, the one similar, if you wish, to the integrated system I was referring before, risking, as the Court of Justice of the European Union told us, to create unnecessary obstacles to the circulation of, to the freedoms of movement of the Union, to Article 114 of the treaty. This is the, I believe, heart of the matter.
Okay, perfect. Arianna, do you want to add something else or?
No, not particularly. Just thank you so much for the discussion and for having us. It was really, really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you to the two of you.
Thank
It was
you.
already mentioned, I think, but Arianna, you or your co-authors will be presenting your work at the next CEPR meeting that took place in Paris in 10 days, I think, on December 18 and 19. And so on December 18, I think it's something around 2. For those of you in Paris, we will have a session with both your paper on media consolidation and the paper we discussed a month ago by Charles Angelucci and Andrea Pratt. For this webinar, next time we meet is on February 13, if I am not misleading, and it will be with Sofiat, with a professor at the ENS Lyon. Thanks again to all of you for attending today's presentation. Thank you a lot to Felipe, as always, for helping me with the organization, and thanks also to Madishan from the CEPR. And one more thing, do not forget, if you want to write some policy piece, for the RPN on media plurality. And it can be, for example, on media consolidation, with some implications related to your work or like different topics. Please feel free to send us any policy piece that you might have. Thank you again, and see you very soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.